All right, let's jump right in. We're about to explore a really powerful story from history, a major clash between state power and religious faith. It's a story that really makes you ask, what happens when your government demands everything from you, and you have to choose between your beliefs and your own survival? And that question, that's the absolute heart of the material we're digging into today. It's a tough dilemma that people have faced throughout history, and we're going to see exactly how it played out in the super high-stakes world of the Japanese Empire back in the early 20th century. So, picture this. Imperial Japan is expanding its empire, and fast. But with a bigger empire comes a huge problem. How do you get all these different people on the same page? Well, their solution was to create a single unifying ideology. And right at the center of it was a practice that became a serious test of faith for their solution was to create a single unifying ideology. And right at the center of it was a practice that became a serious test of faith for their solution was to create a single unifying ideology. And right at the center of it was a practice that became a serious test of faith for their solution was to create a single unifying ideology. And right at the center of it, their solution was to create a single unifying ideology. And right at the center of it was a practice that became a serious test of compromise on your beliefs, but you make sure your church or your organization gets to survive. The second was the path of resistance. You stick to your principles no matter what, and you face the consequences. So let's see how each of these paths actually played out. Okay, so let's start with that first option, the path of compliance. And for this, we're looking at a huge player at the time, one of the most influential religious organizations in colonial Korea. The pressure from the Japanese authorities was just relentless. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. And it built up for years. By September 1938, it all came to a head. The Korean Presbyterian Church held its General Assembly. And get this, it was literally surrounded by police to stamp out any dissent. Under that kind of duress, the leadership voted. They voted to comply. And on the surface, the decision worked. It meant the church, as an institution, got to keep its doors open. Its structure was safe. They avoided the kind of brutal crackdown others were about to face. But, and this is a huge but, the source material we're looking at argues that the survival came at an incredibly steep price. Basically, a compromise of its spiritual soul. But, not everyone chose that path. So what happened to the groups who chose to resist? The ones who looked at the state's demand and just said no. Let's take a look at two groups that refused to bow. First up, the Korean Holiness Church, and what happened to them is fascinating. Imperial Japan didn't just see their refusal as disobedience, they actually reframed the church's core beliefs as a list of crimes. Their belief in the second coming of Christ, that was seen as a direct challenge to the emperor's power. Their historic ties to Western missionaries, that made them an enemy organization. They even twisted their focus on the Old Testament into something sinister. The state's reaction was swift, and it was total. In a single, coordinated crackdown in May of 1943, the empire moved to completely dismantle the church's entire leadership structure. And the numbers involved are just staggering. Across the country, over 200 pastors and ministers were arrested. And they were joined by more than 100 elders and other church leaders. In a single night, the entire leadership was just gone. So the price of resistance was absolute. The state didn't just punish the church, it erased it. The entire organization was forcibly dissolved, all its property seized, and its leaders were thrown in prison. Some of them, like Pastor Lee Woo-young, never made it out alive. And this pattern of resistance wasn't just happening in Korea. Over in Japan itself, a Buddhist-based organization called Soka Gakkai, led by Tsunesaburo Makiguchi and Josei Toda, also made a stand. They flat out refused to comply. And the result for them was strikingly similar. In July of 1943, their entire leadership was arrested. Their organization, which was about 3,000 families strong, was completely wiped out, basically overnight. And just over a year later, the founder, Tsunesaburo Makiguchi, died in prison. He became a martyr for his faith. So for Soka Gakkai, resistance meant total destruction. Okay, but this is where the story takes a really fascinating turn. Because for Soka Gakkai, total destruction was not the end. In fact, you could almost say it was the beginning. Just think about this. When the co-founder, Josei Toda, was released from prison in 1945, there was practically nothing left. No active members to speak of, the organization was gone. He was, for all intents and purposes, starting from absolute zero. But what happens next is just remarkable. The speed of the comeback is amazing. Toda starts rebuilding, essentially from nothing. By 1951, he's named president, and just 7 years after that, the organization he resurrected from the ashes achieved an absolutely astonishing milestone. By 1958, that's just 13 years after it had been completely crushed, Soka Gakkai had grown to 750,000 member households. And here's the kicker. The source material argues that this incredible revival didn't happen in spite of their wartime suffering, but because of it. Their resistance to the state's militarism and the martyrdom of their founder gave them immense moral authority in a post-war Japan that was desperately searching for new values. So what is the big lesson here? What's the main takeaway that the source material draws from this incredible history? Why does this story of compliance and resistance still matter today? Well, the source we've been looking at uses this whole historical story to build a very specific argument for the present day. The author basically says that the fundamental choice from the 1940s, that choice between compromising to survive or resisting to maintain integrity, is the exact same choice their own religious movement is facing right now. And the source's conclusion is really clear. It argues that history teaches us a lesson. The path of compliance might let your institution survive for a little while, but it leads to stagnation and a loss of what makes you special. Resistance, on the other hand, might lead to immediate collapse and suffering, but that's what forges the moral authority needed for a powerful, legitimate revival later on. And we'll end on this final quote from the source, which really sums up its argument. A leader who is martyred in prison to protect doctrine remains forever in history. It's a really provocative thought, and it leaves us with a profound question about sacrifice, leadership, and faith. For any of us, what's the true price of our convictions?